So I've always joked that I'm finally presenting on a subject I know something about, performing failure. In a press interview for the 2016 film Florence Foster Jenkins, the director Stephen Frears spoke about how venerated actress Meryl Streep prepared for the role of the eponymous New York socialite and soprano who enthralled early 20th century American audiences with her ostentatious concert attire and musical incompetence. Frears describes how Streep, who has in several films sung to great acclaim over the years, captured Jenkins's trademark warble. He said, "Meryl's a very good, trained singer, and you can only sing that badly if you can sing that well. She worked very, very hard and was very skillful at it. When you listen to Florence, she almost gets the pitch right, but doesn't quite, and that's why it's so dreadful. Meryl perfectly and discreetly did it. She just turned up and was fully equipped and did it." Streep prepared for the role of Madame Jenkins by listening to her recordings, she has said in interviews. This technique, imitating a model, is the classical rhetorical strategy of imitatio, a practice still in use in the early modern era, and a key component of 16th and 17th century English pedagogical curricula, poetry, and dramatic arts. My talk today explores the sound of vocal failure on the early modern stage through the case of Jemmy, née James LaRoche, a precocious and professional child singer whose final theatrical role, much like Meryl Streep's, imitated the sounds of an incompetent musician. Thanks to the ubiquity of the burden or refrain of a tune LaRoche performed at Lincoln's Inn Fields in the late 17th century, his performance and the political implications of his character circulated well beyond his limited run on the stage. Recent musicological and literary history studies, such as those by many of the people here today, have theorized vocal performance in early modern England with methods combining evidentiary support and phenomenological approaches. Today, I'll talk about learned wisdom for proper vocal emanations, and then examine what could have been LaRoche's models for bad singing. Finally, I'll contextualize the afterlives of LaRoche's performance, character, and tune by examining their circulation and reiteration across various media in the 17th century. Early modern writers and musicians agreed singing had moral and spiritual advantages and was extremely beneficial for both mind and body. In the preface to his 1588 publication, Psalms, Sonnets, and Songs of Sadness and Piety, William Byrd proclaims, "Since singing is so good a thing, I wish all men would learn to sing." The composer goes on to qualify, however, that singing, especially where the voices are good, and the same well sorted and ordered, is even better than instrumental music and is an honor and service to God. Singing was beneficial for body and mind. It exercised the internal and external organs, enlivened the internal spirits, and produced heavenly concords. In the Principles of Music, early modern parson Charles Butler advises singing for a vigorous constitution because it causes health of body, it being a special means to clear and strengthen the lungs. And finally, Henry Peacham the Younger agrees that singing openeth the breast and pipes and is a most ready help for bad pronunciation. While good singing was, like concords in music, the most desirable outcome for sound production according to these treatises, early modern writers also addressed bad singing. John Dowland's translation of Andreas Arnothoparkis's Micrologus, or an introduction containing the art of singing, includes a final chapter instructing musicians in 10 precepts necessary for every singer. While much of the advice in this section is quite detailed and practical, Arnothoparkis also warns, "Let a singer take heed, lest he begin too loud, braying like an ass, or where he hath begun with an uneven height, disgrace the song. For God is not pleased with loud cries, but with lovely sounds. To sing without law and measure is an offense to God himself." Thomas Gainford likewise advises that good manners means one should not offer to sing aloud, especially having an untunable voice. Unpleasant sounds and possible damnation aside, physical punishment could also be a consequence of bad singing. The diarist Samuel Pepys describes a night in March of 1661 wherein he visited the newly reopened Red Bull Theatre. He reported seeing a disastrous production of William Rowley's All's Lost by Lust, wherein he witnessed so much disorder that in the music room, the boy that was to sing a song, not singing it right, his master fell about his ears and beat him so that put the whole house in an uproar. The bad singing decried by these authors is usually a result of lack of training or faulty alignment with cosmic similitudes. In the case of trained child actor Jemmy LaRoche, however, he was cast to sing badly on purpose. Jemmy LaRoche was one of a handful of named child singers in the Restoration London's professional theatre scene. Employed by Thomas Betterton's company at Lincoln's Inn Fields in the 1690s, LaRoche specialized in the music of the theater's house composer, John Eccles. LaRoche would go on to play the juvenile characters in theatrical entertainments by Joseph Harris, George Granville, and Peter Matteau, performing alongside star Restoration actors and actresses like Anne Bracegirdle and William Congreve. LaRoche may have made his London theatrical debut at Lincoln's Inn Fields in late December 1695 as an uncredited singer in George Granville's The She-Gallants. When the second volume of the song collection De Lycée Musicae was published in the following year, it contained the song So Well Corinna Likes the Joy from Granville's play and bore the subtitle Sung by Young LaRoche, a boy of 7 years old. This age may or may not be accurate. Song sheets functioned like advertisements for actors and actresses, and perhaps the point was just to communicate that LaRoche was prodigious for his age. Regardless, LaRoche must have had considerable talent as a young singer based on the other music that was written for him. For instance, only one duet is extant from the music for Peter Matteau's 1697 entertainment, The Novelty, a short pastoral comedy masked tragedy and farce after the Italian manner. This entertainment includes The Mask of Hercules, also with music by Eccles. The published play text lists, sorry, I'll go back here for a second, lists LaRoche in the dramatis personae as one of Hercules's children, along with the child actress Lucretia Bradshaw. Their duet, Hio, Pray Father, illustrates the prodigious talent of the two young singers, long melismas and interwoven melodic lines. The role of Cupid in Matteau's 1696 play, The Loves of Mars and Venus, was written for LaRoche as well. Here he sang opposite Thomas Hodgson and Anne Bracegirdle, two of the most famous and successful Restoration actor-singers at the time. In late 1697, there he is, and it's Cupid and Bracegirdle and Hodgson down below as Venus. In late 1697, LaRoche was cast as an itinerant Savoyard in Matteau's and Eccles' Europe's Revels for the Peace of Ryswick, a ballet des nations performed first at court and then at Lincoln's Inn Fields to celebrate the treaty with Louis XIV, ending military campaigns between England, France, Spain, and Holland. Here, LaRoche sings a simple, repetitive, ballad-style tune. LaRoche's number, Rarey Show, is quite different from previous songs assigned to him. Simplistic and limited in range, Rarey Show approximates a street performance by an untrained musician. Eccles, Matteau, and LaRoche would have had ample opportunity to model their singing Savoyard on itinerant musicians wandering London's streets in the late 17th century. Savoyards, like the character LaRoche played in Europe's Revels, were common fixtures at the turn of the 18th century in London. Showmen from southern France and northern Italy were known for traveling entertainments made of boxes containing a miniature scene or moving figurines. Within these portable stages, a viewer might peer through a peephole, much like a camera obscura, to witness a small tableau or a collection of exotic objects, while the showman provided a musical enticement, such as a song, a gallant show, or a shadow puppet pantomime. Contemporaneous writers describe how the showmen would wander up and down and have their box whereabout they go, usually upon their back, and sometimes accompanied by a pipe and drum. This arguably derisive term Rarey Show was adopted to approximate the Savoyard accent. The instrumentation or singing style of a rare showman had to account for their theatrical space, that is, no rapt audiences and intimate candlelight of the indoor theaters. As you can see in this scene from Hogarth's engraving Southwark Fair, the rare showman here uses a very loud hurdy-gurdy to cut through the din of the bustling outdoor urban scene. The writings of learned musicians and apologists describe the sonic experience of rare showmen and other performers bad singing on London streets. Pastoral poet William Browne likened his local balladmonger's singing to as harsh a noise as ever a cartwheel made. Though the seller addresses an attentive route, he squeaks and muddles his way through the ballad until he finally, half part he chants and will not sing out. Playwright Abraham Crowley hints at the indigent state of most ballad sellers when he describes a performance by singers that hobbles like the fellow with the wooden leg that sings them. In his description of a ballad monger in his 1631 Whimsies, or a new cast of characters, Richard Braithwaite writes that the penurious poet sings with a voice that halts and hobbles as lamely as a one-legged canter. Despite their protestations about sound quality, learned writers certainly had intimate familiarity with street singers and ample opportunity to experience their performances. Laroche and his teachers may have drawn firsthand inspiration and imitation for his Savoyard character's sound from these braying and bawling ballad sellers. Laroche could have modeled his characterization of a Savoyard musician through the early modern practice of imitatio, that is, the pedagogical and dramatic art of imitating a model to learn its secrets or discover aspects of the human condition. The playwright John Webster reminds us that what we see an actor personate, we think truly done before us. Whatsoever is commendable in the grave orator is most exquisitely perfect in him, for by a full and significant action of body, he charms our attention. Likewise, Thomas Heywood, in his Apology for Actors, also notes that the effects of a good actor are as if the personator were the man personated. So bewitching a thing is lively and well-spirited action, that it hath power to new mold the hearts of the spectators. These dramatists were no doubt influenced by the curricula in early modern English schools, which trained burgeoning orators in classical rhetoric. Writers such as Cicero and Quintilian wrote that in addition to imitating a model, orators should also draw upon their own experiences and emotions to persuade effectively. These lessons are evident in the notes of a 16th century schoolboy, wherein he writes that, quote, Cicero saith it is almost impossible for an orator to stir up a passion in his auditors, except he be first affected with the same passion himself. Laroche and perhaps even composer John Eccles might have done some field research in London's marketplaces to locate an imitative model, such as Old Harry, pictured here, who have written about at greater length elsewhere, upon which to base the role of a Savoyard for Europe's revels. Of all the numbers in Europe's revels, it was Laroche's song that lived beyond the theater. Eccles's printed music for Rary Show is simple and repetitive. It's composed in a D major tonality. It never modulates. It has 3 sections that switch between triple meter, duple, and finally compound triple, so very dance-like. The beginning is features an almost recitative-like intonation on D. The last 2 sections of the tune are repeated another 8 times, much like a broadside ballad, with subsequent verses printed beneath the tune. It is nothing like the florid theater songs Eccles wrote for Laroche in the previous years. However, its incessant repetition and simple melody may have afforded Laroche the opportunity to do some creative voice acting, or perhaps even some improvisatory street-style roaring or hobbling upon the tune while marching through the verses. Laroche's performance was impactful, and we can trace this impact by following the circulation of the song's refrains, seen here, and the reiteration of its verses across various media. Some of these artifacts were published in 1698 and 1713 and indicate a familiarity with the text from Europe's revels, and thus perhaps an audience and readership beyond the theater goers at Lincoln's Inn Field. The earliest was a broadside published by Edward Ward in 1698, just months after the Lincoln's Inn Fields performances, and it uses the same phrase as Mateau's Burden. Ward's broadside does not contain any musical notation or even a tune indication. It is, however, structurally and metrically similar enough to Eccles' extremely adaptable musical setting that it would not be difficult to sing these verses here to Eccles' music. A 1713 reissue of Ward's broadside, which is perhaps reissued this year in particular to comment upon the Peace of Utrecht, with which the English had some cultural anxiety. And it differs only slightly in some of the, what people have called franglais spelling, so this sort of French-English spelling, and some of the censored names are changed. The text uses the same structure as Mateau's. That is, each stanza begins, "Here be thee," and goes through kind of a list of international characters. And in this case, it lists political figures involved in the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht. The complex matrix of political satire here, that is requiring a listener to know Europe's rebels, or that it was written for the Treaty of Ryswick, and that the theatrical ballad was sung by a Savoyard character, assumes a level of familiarity with not only current events, but also perhaps the popularity of Laroche's performance. Lastly, there's the case of this 1713 mezzotint by Sutton Nichols, which supposedly depicts Laroche himself, singing his song and displaying his cabinet to some curious children. Eccles's original tune is included at the bottom of the print, with the same 9 stanzas of text repeated from Watteau's 1698 script. The Nichols image here, though, is actually a copy of an Isaac Beckett mezzotint. Beckett died in 1688, around the time Jemmy Laroche was probably born. So the fact that Laroche's name was attached to the image, though it's not his actual likeness, indicates his enduring connection to this particular role. The circulation of popular song, ballads, and their subject material, like the intermedial transfer of ideas through the O'Reilly Show refrain, just based on these 2 examples, depended upon repetition. The most impactful way in which the message of the ballad could be received and circulated by the listener was through repeated communal performance of its refrain. Ballad scholar Natasha Wurzbach has insisted that one purpose of the broadside ballad refrain was, quote, to unite the audience through communal singing, thereby backing up the message. Some ballad texts themselves do implore listeners to, quote, sing, oh sing, the day is clear, come, oh come and sing with me, or, quote, come then and sing with me, sad sobs of well-a-day. Contemporaneous literary references to communal ballad singing also focus on the refrain as the point of group performance. John Dryden, in his translation of the works of Virgil, writes that, quote, one choir of old, another of the young, to dance and bear the burden of the song. Dryden's characterization of song performance in The Lady in the Arbor from Fables is reminiscent of a balladeer inviting audience participation. She raised her voice on high and sung so clear, the fawns came scudding from the groves to hear, and all the bending forest lent an ear. At every close she made, the attending throng replied and bore the burden of the song. So powerful was the idea of a refrain that many 17th century texts referenced the idea of a song or a ballad refrain metaphorically. In fact, to sing the burden often referred more poetically to a thematic thread in one's life, the most important point of an argument or an overarching idea, such as to sing the burden of our times or to sing the burden of my great unrest. Texts unconcerned directly with ballad singing or music also routinely commented on the repetition involved in refrain performance. Biblical passages, for instance, should be, quote, oft repeated as the burden of a song, and one must repeat over again the burden of a song in order to, for example, ensure the comprehension of a subject. While I found, sadly, no evidentiary support to confirm this notion, the structure of O'Reilly Show, its multiple verses, and the ubiquity of its reiterations outside of Europe's revels suggests that perhaps Laroche led the audience to sing the burden with him during the performances at Lincoln's Inn Fields. While the verses were altered, it is the O'Reilly Show refrain from Watteau's Entertainment that is repeated in political broadsides in the following years, connecting them to a popular theatrical depiction of an incompetent musician. Repetition affects cultural memory in that audiences hear and see a ballad refrain repeated and performed. Through this repetition, they can not only build community, but also reinforce the message of the text, as Wurzbach suggests. In a much broader sense, refrains can be transmitted through their repeated references in disparate genres and performance venues for an even wider range of audiences. Performance studies scholar Diana Taylor, in her book, The Archive and the Repertoire, asserts that, quote, performances function as vital acts of transfer, transmitting social knowledge, memory, and a sense of identity through reiterated, or what performance scholar Richard Schechner has called twice behaved behavior. Laroche reiterates a young Savoyard with a O'Reilly Show. a performance within a performance, he draws upon his audience's recollections of the bawling street performers so familiar to Londoners in the 1690s and mimics their inexact utterances. His imitation of failure, that is, we know from documentary evidence that Laroche could sing, it captivated audiences and led to the wide dissemination of both his supposed likeness as well as the lyrics of his stage song. Likewise, the reiteration of Eccles's otherwise unremarkable tune, both attached to and unmoored from Laroche's embodied performance of the role, transmitted political satire and preserved his fame in the public's collective memory long after the talented boy left the professional stage. Jemmy Laroche may have been assigned the role of Savoyard with a Rarey show precisely because he was a fine singer. Laroche's character had to be convincing, since it was probably, like Meryl Streep's Madame Jenkins, based upon a well-known model. More often than not, early modern Londoners were probably surrounded by more bad singing than good. The number of meaty dramatic roles imitating street musicians from the period leads one to believe that despite protestations to the contrary, early modern listeners delighted in musical incompetence almost as much as we do. It's entertaining. Musicology and musical performance often privilege an ideal text, the text, a critical edition, a flawless, rehearsed, perfectly auto-tuned performance. It is vital to remember that a flawed performance, bad singing, and failure were hallmarks of the 17th century soundscape and theatrical experience, and they therefore deserve our attention and preservation. By attending to evidence of bad singing, amateur circulation, and marginalized performers in early modern England, we can reconceive of the networks of musical circulation, performance practices, and transient theatrical spaces. Thanks so much.